Welcome to Queertuhan. Queertuhan is a podcast organized by the Development Society of the Ateneo. Here at Queertuhan, we strive to amplify the voices of underrepresented minorities so that we can move beyond stereotypes and confront the lived reality of the LGBTQIA+ community in the Philippines. Joining us today as we talk about the much debated SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill is our host, Ulrik Espinosa. Ulrik is a third-year student taking AB Philippine Studies major in Filipino and mass media. As an advocate for children's rights, literacy, and development, he is currently a junior executive of DLSU Archers for UNICEF. His topics of interest in research and literature focus on Philippine gay history, Philippine gay culture, Philippine pop culture, and Philippine media studies. Without further ado, this is SOGIE for SOGIE, hosted by Ulrik Espinosa with Mix Nicky Castillo from Metro Manila Pride for today's Queertuhan.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Queertuhan. I am Ulrik Espinosa, and I will be your host for this episode. So, after attending a master class organized by the Development Society of Ateneo and getting to engage with and learn from members of the LGBTQIA plus community, members and allies alike were moved to create a platform where members of the community could share their stories and hopefully improve the perception and treatment towards the community. One of the first things that came to mind was the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill, which is one of the movements towards achieving nationwide SOGIE equality that also put the LGBTQIA plus community in the spotlight. So, joining us today in our dialogue about the Filipino LGBTQIA plus community's continuing fight against discrimination is Nicky H. Castillo, one of the overall co-coordinators of Metro Manila Pride. Nicky currently serves as the Deputy Director of Rainbow Rights Philippines and sits on the steering committee of the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. Their work also includes providing technical consultancy for the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill and developing Metro Manila Pride's various learning spaces. Okay, so welcome, Nicky.
Hey, hi, Ulrik. Thank you for inviting us and for having us and for also having this initiative. It sounds really, really cool. And I'm glad you folks have it at the Ateneo.
And thank you so much for gracing our event today. So,
It's my
Nikki,
pleasure.
would you like to tell us about Metro Manila Pride? What is it exactly?
So Metro Manila Pride, we are a volunteer-run organization, which is how most LGBTQIA plus organizations are in the Philippines. A lot of them are just, uh, nobody's really full time. Very few are full time. So, like most of organizations in the Philippines that work on LGBTQI plus rights, we are volunteer run, and our main mission is to equip, educate, and empower Filipino LGBTQIA plus persons and their communities so that they can work together towards a world where LGBTQIA plus people can live a dignified life that's free from based discrimination and prejudice. Some of the ways that we do this is through community building activities like the Pride March. So we consider the Pride March a community building activity and all of the other activities and events around the Pride season. Where we gather folks and then we sort of try to make people see, hey, these are your people, we're together, like there's a lot of us. And we also do this through discussion groups. We call our discussion groups hangouts. So before this whole pandemic, we used to do hangouts in person, and now we've adapted them online, like most of us have. And we also do Twitter convos or Twitter parties. And for the most part, these discussion groups, they serve both as educational discussions and support groups. So while we're talking about a particular topic that pertains or is relevant to the community, we also talk about like how is it personally relevant to you, like what are your experiences, and learning from each other and how we can overcome these things or cope with the ongoing discrimination that we experience as LGBTQIA plus persons. And we're also starting to get into research on issues that matter to the community. And it's defunct right now. It's like a dormant right now, but we also have a program on creating spaces for art and expression. So mostly those are the ways that we try to achieve our mission at Metro Manila Pride.
All right, thank you, Nikki. So hopefully our listeners here today, would be inspired to take part in the different advocacies that you present for their participation to forward the advocacy to support the LGBTQI plus community here in the Philippines. So I'd like to know, would you like to share how the 2020 Metro Manila Pride March took place, knowing that it happened online? So how was it, Nikki?
Right. It was a struggle, because we just came from 70,000 plus from 2019,
Mhm.
and we were already planning on scaling up everything. From experience, the numbers tend to triple every year. So we were planning on scaling up from the 70,000 in 2019 and going to a big place in 2020. So what we finally landed on, it was supposed to be in Pasay, and we were already talking to the Cultural Center of the Philippines if we could hold it there. And then everything, the Fire Nation attacked, so and so, so to speak. And the pandemic came down, and the lockdown came on, and it took us a while to get our bearings,
Mhm.
just because we couldn't conceive of how are we supposed to do this online.
Mhm.
And in the beginning we were thinking, maybe it's not going to be that long, maybe, in 3 months, because there were projections
Mhm.
that after 3 months, everything would be okay. But clearly, more than, almost a year into this, it
Mhm.
wasn't okay. So we had decided to just try to take everything online. There were a lot of suggestions on how to do things. But mostly, what we did was, get the program part, like where we have different queer and trans folks from the community performing, um, and the solidarity speeches part, and put it all into one. I think it was a 3-hour program, and then Facebook kept on cutting our feed.
Mhm.
But it was pretty cool. We got some lots of messages, solidarity messages from different parts of the community. There were messages from the Bakwit School of the Lumad
Mhm.
kids who are currently in UP Diliman,
Mhm.
from the religious and faith-based groups, from the HIV and AIDS groups, and all of the different, community organizers in the Philippines. No, not in the Philippines. Sorry, in Metro Manila.
Mhm.
We also got performers and some and support from artists that we didn't expect to lend their voices, or at least, their screens to us.
Mhm.
Angina gave a pre-recorded performance. Crystal Method gave a pre-recorded performance, and Catherine Bernardo, and so many folks, Kaki Pangilinan, so many folks lent
Mhm.
their voices to this platform. And the vice president of the Philippines also came on board, and she was actually the one who reached out to us.
Mhm.
We Wait, I might be misremembering this, so if you can cut this part out. uh, but like, she was on the program, and she's always been such a supporter. And we were so thrilled that she wanted to give such a really nice message to the community, especially during these times. And it was just so difficult, and it still is so difficult for LGBTQIA plus folks, who are often, even if they're with family, they're in social isolation, just because a lot of them don't live with family who accepts them, or it's a noxious home environment. So just to hear and see people support, the support
Mhm.
from these big name people who have such huge platforms, I think it was really important for folks to see that. So yeah, hopefully we'll do better this year and see how we can innovate.
Definitely, definitely something to look forward to another year. And one thing that we could consider is that with the online platform that we have, it's a different way of democratizing the accessibility of information, participation.
Yeah,
So it's really nice what you have planned ahead for this. So now let's go over to our main topic for the day, Nikki, which is the SOGIE Bill. So, would you like to give us and our listeners an overview of what the SOGIE Bill is?
sure. So the SOGIE Quality Bill, or what we're trying to, go back to calling it the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill. It's a 22-year-old bill, so it's turning 22 this year. It was filed first by Congressperson Eta Rosales in 1999 by a few members of the LGBTQIA plus community. It was crafted initially by Lagablab, which I think back then it stood like the Lagablab stood for something. I think it was the Lesbian and Gay something Legislative Alliance. Oh, they're gonna crucify me. I don't remember the acronym, but so they were these pioneering activists who helped craft this bill with Representative Rosales at the time. And so we've been fighting for it for 22 years. As far as I know, it's one of the longest pieces of legislation that has to have, has to go through this whole process. And essentially, it is a measure or a piece of legislation that aims to justly account for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, or what we like to call SOGIE, just so it's not just such a mouthful. And under this legislative measure, this law or this bill, um, it aims to protect persons from SOGI-based discrimination in a number of different places, because you can experience SOGI-based discrimination in so many places. And some of these are, it wants to prohibit discrimination on the basis of SOGI in employment, whether in public or in private workplaces. Um, Under the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill, you're not supposed to, reject acceptance of students in an educational institution based on their SOGI or of the SOGIs of their parents or guardians. This bill also prohibits imposing sanctions that are harsher than necessary on the basis of SOGI of the students or of their parents. It prohibits denying access to private or public medical or health services, or you're also not allowed to deny people utilities, the use of facilities, establishments, or housing on the basis of their SOGIS. It wants to prohibit forced medical or psychological evaluation on the basis of SOGIS. Also, the revocation or the refusal of groups forming, just because if in a workplace you want to form a group for LGBTQI plus employees and allies, and the management doesn't want that to happen because it's not part of the company culture. Under this bill, that's not allowed. You have to let them organize. It also wants to prohibit discrimination on the basis of SOGI when it comes to processing, granting, or revoking licenses and permits, except for marriage. I'm gonna just get that in there just because it's one of the things that people keep on saying, that it's a gateway bill to marriage equality. It is not. It's a completely different piece of legislation. Um, the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill also wants to encourage, not encourage, wants to discourage the creation of stigma on the basis of SOGIS in media and textbooks and all other forms of media. It's also prohibited to incite violence and sexual abuse on the basis of SOGIS. And also, if you publish something to out persons, um, without their consent, and usually if you out somebody, it's usually without their consent, so that's going to be prohibited under this measure. But this legislative measure is not just about prohibitions, because that's not how we can get to the changes that we need. It also includes affirmative actions or programs, such as creating redress mechanisms or ways for people to access justice by creating SOGIS desks in police stations. Because currently, when LGBTQA plus persons or persons who are discriminated on the basis of their SOGI go to police stations, they don't really know where to go. Some send them to the Women and Children Protections Desk. Some just go, to the regular desk, and it's almost never documented as, this is something that happened to me because of my SOGI. And then the bill also hopes to mandate the creation of programs to promote non-discrimination and diversity. So in public and private institutions, they're gonna ask them to create diversity and inclusion policies, to create social protection programs, and information and educational materials, things to help create cultural change. That's the bill. I know it's not brief, but it's been 22 years in the making, and I don't see any way in making that super concise. But that's the heart of the bill. That's what it is. Yeah.
All right. So, Nikki, thank you so much for laying that out for what exactly the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill is for the community. Now, let's look into the status of this bill. So, knowing all of this and knowing how important the passage of this bill is for the community, what exactly now is the current status of the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill, and what barriers is it facing?
So the SOGIE specific anti-discrimination bill, they've filed versions of it both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, it's under the Committee on Gender and Women, on Women and Gender Equality, and it's still in the committee hearing phase. So that's the period of, like, when when you pass a bill where the legislators are all there and they try to deliberate on the best version of the bill. So usually legislators create their own versions of the bill, and then at the end, the objective is to consolidate it. So this is like the final version of their bill at the committee level, and then they move it up to the plenary where all the other legislators hear it and deliberate on it. It's also at this stage where they invite members of legislators, like, this is why we need the bill, these provisions are problematic, or we would like to see these provisions be included. And usually in committee hearings, you hear the supporters and the detractors of the bill. So I don't know if you follow, if you're on Twitter, a lot of organizations are doing live tweets when it comes to these committee hearings. So the the SOGIE specific anti-discrimination bill in the House is currently at that level in the committee, and it still hasn't moved from the committee. Hopefully it's gonna move past the committee, and they're gonna form the consolidated bill so that we can move on to going to the plenary for it. In the Senate, there's better news. So it last December, if I'm not mistaken, it was December 1st.
Mhm.
It was they passed the committee report, so they created the consolidated bill, and now they've forwarded that version of the bill to the Senate plenary. So this is the part point where you see the different legislators arguing about, is this part needed, is this part really needed, trying to see how they can improve the bill
Mhm.
um, to satisfy usually their constituents. But supposedly it's supposed to be the part of the creating the law where you can make a better law that
Mhm.
protects people. So that's where we are in terms of the national
Mhm.
legislation that aims to prohibit discrimination on the basis of SOGI.
Okay, so now we know that this is already 22 years old, and this is where we are now. So, with that, why do you think that the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill has been met with so much aggression, fear, and negativity? Mhm.
Right. So when you sent us these questions and I read this, I was thinking the easy answer would be, well, because there's a lot of just horrible people out there. But I think the more accurate answer would be like, there's so much misinformation.
Mhm.
There's so much misinformation and disinformation.
Mhm.
So there's a, an active effort out there by detractors of the bill to
Mhm.
create fallacies about the bill so that it can scare folks who don't really understand what the legislative measure is about, because it's legal documents like laws, they're so difficult to read. If
Mhm.
you're I don't have a law background, but after years of engaging with this piece of legislation, I understand it now. But there are still some things that I don't understand, especially when they put new things in, or different wordings. It's such a technically worded bill.
Yeah.
Right. So whether or not you support the bill, it's difficult to read if you don't have that background. And
Mhm.
of course, you're going to want to go to somebody who's, can you explain this bill to me? Like, what is it really about? And if you consider this person an authority or a credible person, then you'll take that word as fact. And a lot of folks abuse this position of credibility or authority in their communities by creating, all of these just lies about the anti-discrimination bill, the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill. And I think that's where all of the aggression and the fear and negativity is coming from.
Mhm.
Because we've heard from folks who say that, their parents or their friends, they used to be against the bill, but once they explain what the bill is about, they understand. Oh, okay, so this is all
Mhm.
you wanted to do, and this is all the bill is about. It's not really about the things that were told to me,
Mhm.
that they were
Mhm.
about. So I think that's the root of it. But also, I think the drive to create all of these disinformation and misinformation comes from um, people who want to keep the status quo, people
Mhm.
who want to reinforce a cis heteropatriarchal community or
Mhm.
society where folks like LGBTQA plus people aren't allowed to live a life of dignity that's free from discrimination and violence just because of who they are, who they love, and what they look like. So that's I think the very very root of it, and that's what drives the decision to spread all of this disinformation and misinformation about the bill.
All right. So now, in battling all of this disinformation, misinformation, these supposed special privileges and what ifs, what can you recommend to our listeners here today on how they can educate ourselves and the steps that they can take to educate others as well when it comes to dispelling these myths?
um there are a lot of organizations out there. Most LGBTQA plus organizations are trying to break down the bill. The best way to combat disinformation is to read the source material, but again, it's so difficult to understand. If you have access to the information to be able to understand and comprehend the source material, which is the bill itself, then that's going to help you sort of
Mhm.
try to combat this disinformation and misinformation. But if you don't, or it's just it's too difficult for you to understand, I would suggest going to different organizations who have released sort of primers on the bill. Some of the ones that come to mind, Lagablab has released some. You can go to their social media pages. Bahaghari Filipinas has
Mhm.
released one. I think TLF Share has released them. And I'm pretty sure, like for example, if you're not in Metro Manila and you're in, let's say you're in Cebu, reach out
Mhm.
to organizations there and ask them, can you tell me more about this bill? Especially if there is a language barrier.
Mhm.
If the material is in Tagalog, or
Yeah.
it's so these orgs will, I'm sure, want to explain these things to you. So I think that's the best way to combat the disinformation and misinformation.
Mhm.
um yeah. Talk to
All
people
right.
and read up.
Thank you so much, Nikki. So now let's focus into particular members of the LGBTQI plus community. So last November, we know that Metro Manila Pride held the event Buhay Trans at Non-Binary sa Pilipinas that touched light on the reality of living SOGI. So lately, there has been, at the very least, more visibility of transgender and non-binary people, especially as leaders and change makers, and not merely as the entertainment hypotheticals or caricatures that we've been used to. However, especially here in the Philippines, there is what we might consider minority groups. So, what can you say about this attitude in the Philippines towards transgender?
Based just on experience of activist groups on the ground, things that you
Mhm.
see online. stories that we hear from people, it's mostly violent.
Mhm.
The attitude of most Filipinos towards trans and non-binary folks are, it's mostly violent and really discriminatory. That's and it's horrible, and it's
Mhm.
horrible that that's their reality. Yeah.
So, when given these situations, wherein sometimes we ourselves, given that we've been accustomed to this heteronormal patriarchal society, there are situations where people might not even realize that we are perpetuating the stigma and discrimination against these minority groups. So what are some ways wherein we can change our attitudes, change towards consciousness, and change our norms in order to advocate for the rights and welfare, particularly of our fellow transgender and non-binary Filipinos?
Mostly, I would say listen to trans and non-binary people, because they know their experiences better than anybody else does. um, Reach out to groups, and see what you're doing, but also acknowledge that, because like in our world right now, because there's so much information out there, a lot of us
Mhm.
try to, can you explain this to me, can you tell me more about this issue, which comes from a good place. There's good intent there, but we also need to remember that trans and non-binary folks and other, marginalized folks, they get this question over and over again, and it's not like the information isn't out there. So I
Mhm.
think folks who want to be allies or accomplices of the trans and non-binary community, let's do our own research. Do your own research, read about these things, and if you have further questions that you can't find, then talk to, trans and non-binary activists or persons, and I'm sure they'll try to help you out if they can, if they have the capacity to do it. It's not bad to ask questions, but I think also we need to remember, why are we asking these questions? Because sometimes, not sometimes, a lot of times, trans and non-binary people get asked about their body a lot,
Mm.
and for the most part, it's about gender reaffirmation surgery that is asked of them, and if you're somebody who needs to know about the experience of a trans person, their personal experience with, their body and surgery or other medical transitions I've made, I think we need to take a step back and think, why do I need to
Mhm.
know this about this particular person? Is it even my business? And
Mhm.
how does this help you understand the struggles of trans and non-binary folks? And how does it help you um, rally for them more? I would hope that we go beyond just, you know, gathering all of the information and actually do something
Mhm.
um, about the information that we have. So, what do you do after you've read everything? After you talk to trans people, it's your responsibility now to talk to other people around you, and teach them. How, like, what are the experience of trans folks? What are their realities? What are the things that you can do? Because we need to remember that. The trans and non-binary folks, there's less of trans and non-binary folks than there are cis folks. There are more cis folks in the world, as far as we know, and trans and non-binary voices aren't in every room, and even when they're in the room, the society is so oppressive and scary when it comes to, transness,
Mhm.
that not all trans and non-binary people will be able to speak up and to advocate for themselves. So then it's our responsibility, or it's the responsibility of other people in the room, to advocate for them. So I think that's one huge thing. But also, we need to remember to never speak over trans people, and trans groups, and try to see, parang say that, I know better than you because I've
Mhm.
read this and this and this, and this is what this person um, said in what I read. Let people let trans folks speak their own truths. You are not giving a voice to the community because they have their own voice. If you have a platform, amplify their voices,
Mhm.
instead of putting your voice over theirs to to talk about exactly the same things that they're talking about. But when they're not in the room, or if nobody's advocating for them, then that's when you use your voice to advocate for them. I think. I'm sorry. Did I answer your
Yes,
question?
yes, Nikki. Thank you very much. So, with all of these non-binary realities, these actually represent unique perspectives that not a lot of advocacies answer to. Like, for example, there are members who may not be as visible in the LGBTQ plus discussions,
Mhm.
especially non-cisgender people of the community and people who fall into the plus and the asterisk under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. So, are there plans that MMMP seeks to undertake to broaden the LGBTQ plus dialogue to include the unique voices of gender non-conforming individuals in this time?
Yes, we do have plans to we some of them we've already rolled out. Like in the past, we had a hangout for folks who identify as asexual, and we've lent the platform that we have to trans folks. But there's definitely a lot more that we can do, and usually when it comes um, to these issues that we might not have more of an expertise on, we want to amplify the voices of other groups who are doing work around it. So, for example, one of the things that we try to do is whenever there's a big news article about, or an issue about trans or non-binary folks in the Philippines, mostly for trans folks,
Mhm.
and a lot of news organizations do reach out to us to, like, what's your perspective, what's your opinion. But for the most part, we try to ask, have you spoken to trans people? Because this is about their community and it's their voices who should be heard. So that's what we try to do most of the time. In terms of creating more activities or undertakings to broaden the dialogue, there are always plans. There are always plans. It's just that there's so many things and there's so few of us in Metro Manila Pride, which is why we try to collaborate more with other organizations as well, so that we can cover a lot more things across all of our networks and communities.
Okay, thank you for that, Nikki. So now, given that we are very hopeful for what the SOGIE specific anti-discrimination bill has to offer for all the members of the community. So when this is passed, how can this bill concretely help Metro Manila Pride in its mission to create educational and empowering spaces for discourse and dialogue on these issues?
When the bill is passed, um it helps us so much, not just Metro Manila Pride, but all of the other organizations, because a lot of the stories that come to us is about discrimination, is about violence, and we do so much awareness raising around all of these issues. And if there's this kind of support from the national government, and this trickles down to private and public organizations, that they have to create these policies, these information campaigns, and all of these other, affirmative action stuff. I think that just creates a better environment for a lot of LGBTQIA plus people. Other, companies and government institutions, they do the awareness raising themselves, and in that way, that concretely reaches so many more people, even more than we can reach, and more than any of the other LGBTQIA plus organizations in the Philippines combined. And that's one of the concrete things, I think. Another way is that we'll hear and see, hopefully, less stories of LGBTQIA plus kids experiencing horrible situations in schools, and they're going to a shrink to try and cure or whatever.
Mhm.
We'll hopefully hear less instances of that if the provisions in the bill to prohibit forced medical. Um, just you know so many things. It's
Mhm.
hard for me to sort of concretize, like to give you like concrete ways on how it affects us,
Mhm.
because whatever affects the communities that we serve directly affects us.
Mhm.
And this bill is so important because it cuts across um, almost all protected classes within the community when it comes to LGBT people. It cuts across, whether you belong to, whether you're richer and middle class, whatever your SOGI is, it cuts across all of these things and just helps you live a life that's, you have one less thing to worry about. You won't
Mhm.
be scared that, oh, if I'm trans and the name on my identification doesn't match what I look like, am I going to be allowed to take an interview for this company, or are they gonna beat me up because I'm
Mhm.
gay, or all of these things. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that question, and how it affects us. Whatever impacts the community, that's how it impacts us as well, because that tells us that, okay, this part of our job is done, or at least we have more help here, and maybe we can address some of the other parts of our
Mhm.
job, while lessening our work here, because there's help out there, and we can address all of the other things that the community faces, which is a lot.
All right. So thank you for that, Nikki. So indeed, thank you for giving that insight. When this becomes policy, it'll definitely help towards unity, because we'll have a unified participation towards safe spaces for the community. Because yes, we'll have national government strengthening this policy, the LGUs and private companies and other organizations. So this will be a unifying step towards safe spaces for all. So now let's zoom into the future. So let's look into the future challenges. As we look towards the future now, how will Metro Manila Pride continue in their advocacy for the LGBTQI plus community, this time knowing that we're still in the current situation of the pandemic?
um This is such a difficult question to answer when it comes to this whole situation we're in, this whole panini, this Panasonic, this pandemic. So it's hard to sort of look into the future and say that this is specifically what we're gonna do. But
Mhm.
I think under this pandemic, we've seen exposed a lot of systemic things that harm our communities. For example, when they put in the lockdowns, which were when there were arbitrary rules on how to enforce a lockdown. I don't know if you heard about this. Like there were kids in Pandakaki, Pampanga, who were made to dance and kiss each other, and they were minors, and it was broadcast on Facebook. And then in Zamboanga, there were trans women who were detained because they didn't follow curfew, and their hair was cut, and they were just humiliated. In Cebu, we heard about reports of trans men who weren't allowed to pass, because remember there were lockdowns and you were not allowed to go to the next city or the next
Mhm.
barangay or something if you don't have business there. And because their picture and their ID doesn't match what they look like, they weren't allowed to go to work, they weren't allowed to go home and things like that. And across the country as well, we heard reports of uh, queer and trans families who weren't allowed to get food and food aid, like different kinds of, I don't know what do you call that? Ayuda. The ayuda
Mhm.
in terms of cash and in food and groceries, right? They weren't allowed to get these things because whoever it was that distributing, the LGU, says that you're not a family. Like you are not defined as a family. Families and queer and trans families, not having food and
Mhm.
relying on other folks to feed them. So, and those are just some of the things that have happened, and it exposes all of the existing systemic weaknesses and inequalities that have already been there. It's just that because of this pandemic, there's like a spotlight put
Mhm.
on them. And I think that's where our future is. Like it's something that we've always been trying to fight against anyway, as advocacy organizations. But this time, since it's brought to light, um, hopefully we'll have more folks trying to, uh, help fight against these things as well, to destroy these kinds of systemic inequalities. And if in this future that you're talking about, we've passed the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill, a person can dream. If in this future this is already passed, there are so many other laws that we also need to pass. There's the gender recognition law, there's the hate crime law, there's marriage equality, of course. All of these different kinds of laws that we need to put in place just so the LGBTQIA plus community can exist a life that's dignified as would exist a dignified life as Filipinos. Um, uh, but aside from that, because this is something that I learned from my colleagues at Galang Philippines. They have this system called the bingka method. So, diba, when you cook a bibingka, there's the fire underneath, and then you put like the hot coals on top of the cake. So there's pressure or there's fire on both ends, like above and below. And according in this diagram or in this method of theirs, above is legislative change, the fire below is cultural change. So even if you pass these laws, but you don't do the cultural change as you pass the laws, then the change that we want, the change that we need doesn't really happen. So this is the future that we need to keep fighting for. Like we all need to keep on talking to folks around the dinner table in our Zoom chats or in our when we finally go back to post-pandemic times around the water cooler in your tambayans in your schools. So all of these things need to happen, and that's how we can continue to fight for justice for the community, to fight for not just inclusion, but again, to live dignified lives that's free from prejudice and discrimination and violence. Yeah, I think that's the future we all want.
Thank you for that, Nikki. So we got 3 points from you. One is that when SOGIE Bill is passed, this will be a beginning for a lot of other progressive steps towards, creating a safer space, a safer community, and towards having a better um point of view towards society. And next is that there needs to be an overhaul in the system because a lot of
Yeah.
problematic um practices that we face come from the system itself, and that we need to take a step forward when it comes to redesigning how exactly we address these situations. Like for example, while it is good on one part that information has been democratized, participation through online platforms with the pandemic, with that different struggles have also risen because of the pandemic that the LGBTQI plus community has been facing. So now, in light of all of these obstacles that we continue to face in this fight for justice, even further burdened by the pandemic, what would Metro Manila Pride and you, Miss Nikki, like to impart to advocates who continue to persist and fight for equal rights?
uh get organized and keep fighting, because there is no way that we'll be able to get these changes in place if you're just by yourself.
Mhm.
um, it's hard. We're fighting a system. We're trying to change a system, and a system is just it's not just a system that was established yesterday. It's decades
Mhm.
in the making. This system has been there for years and years and years, and it's been so it's such an old and pervasive system that some of the things that we think are normal or traditional actually aren't. Like these are things that were created by this system, which tends to favor the cis heteropatriarchy, and puts marginalized folks like LGBTQA plus people at a disadvantage.
Mhm.
So like one person alone can't fight that. There's no way. So find groups or form groups. Like if there are so many groups out there who are fighting towards the same thing, the liberation of LGBTQA plus people, but if you don't want to join them, create your own group in your barangay or in your area. Create them,
Mhm.
and educate yourselves and try to create programs for yourselves and advocate for all of these things. I think getting organized and finding your community is so important. And we have a specific, I think, advantage at this time, at least for those who have access to online spaces. If you don't want to go, or if going to in-person meetings is a security issue for you, you're able to join these groups
Mm-hmm.
through online spaces, because a lot of them have, educational discussions and all of these different activities that they hold online. So you can reach out to them through there. Um, Find a way to educate yourself and educate people around you, and keep fighting. I think that's all we can do, and that's what we should be doing in times where it the situation feels difficult and desolate and depressing.
Mm-hmm.
um, I've found personally that having community and being able to turn to my community and to my group, my people, my family, has helped a lot. It helps you not just mental health wise, um, helps you move forward. And also, they also remind you to rest. I think that's so important as well. And something that we always forget, I think, in fighting for our rights, that it's important for us. We're people. We are not robots.
Mm-hmm.
We can't go 24/7, 365 days a year, um, just fighting and fighting and fighting. You need to recharge, and there is resistance in resting, because in this capitalist society, we are told that you need to be productive every day. We need to resist that capitalist
Mm-hmm.
thinking by resting ourselves also, and when we recharge, we go back to fighting until we get the future that we all deserve. Sorry, Ulrich, is it okay if I add something to one of the things that you asked me earlier?
Sure, sure. Go
Yeah.
ahead. Yes, please.
So I think I just need to sort of expand a little bit more in your question about attitudes of Filipinos towards trans and non-binary people in the Philippines. While there isn't any data, and very clearly the experience of people on the ground is so violent, one of the things that we can look at is, for example, Pemberton's release last sorry, was it September or October? Pemberton's release just last year.
Mm-hmm.
So Joseph Scott Pemberton murdered Jennifer Laude, a trans woman from Olongapo, in 2014. The first injustice there is that he was given a sentence that is way too short. um, and the second is that he was kept in a special facility for him. So it's not really much of a sentence if you're in a facility, you have cushy surroundings and everything. And aside from that, he didn't even finish his already short sentence. He was given a presidential pardon, um, to be given back to the United States. And this just tells you how little society and even the people in power, view the lives of trans people. We don't even get justice in our death, and we have to keep trans people have to keep on explaining themselves and debating the
Mm-hmm.
validity of their own existence. And that's just such a violent way to live,
Mm-hmm.
day in, day out. And seeing the names of all these trans people being brutally, brutally murdered,
Mm-hmm.
um, in media, not just, they're already brutally murdered, and in the media they're dead named. Their deaths are sensationalized, like it's
Yeah.
written in a way that it's meant to shock and awe,
Mm-hmm.
and it dehumanizes them. And so you again kill a trans person again because you dead name them, and then you sensationalize them so you can get clicks or sell papers or whatever. And this is such a violent existence that you have to keep on living through, on top of the other uh, the other things that you need to be doing. You need to work, you need to feed your family, you need to feed yourself, and to exist,
Mm-hmm.
so uh, I can't say much definitively about the attitude of Filipinos with, like, research and stuff, but you can see it around you. That's how violent things are for trans people and non-binary folks in the Philippines. So yeah, I just wanted to, because I don't want to, to forget that, because that's such an important thing. Like, after Pemberton was granted his presidential pardon, not even a month later, Donna Niera was found murdered in Caloocan. So it's just, sort of like punctuates the situation even more, that the injustice just happens in life and in death and beyond death. It keeps on happening. So the violent cycle is there for trans people and non-binary folks.
Okay, all right. So thank you so much for your poignant sharing, Nikki. It definitely puts a period at the end of this very inspiring sentence of a Queertuhan session today. So that signals the end of our sharing in our short Queertuhan for today. So to recap, today we made cuento with one Nicky Castillo, one of the overall co-coordinators of Metro Manila Pride, Deputy Director of Rainbow Rights Philippines, and member of the steering committee of the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, and technical consultant for the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill. So Nikki, thank you so much for making cuento with us today, and would you like to give a shout out to Metro Manila Pride or anyone in particular? Please feel free to do so.
Oh, thank you for having us, for thinking of us for your first episode. It's such an honor. Shout out to everyone at Metro Manila Pride. You folks are awesome, and I'm glad to be working alongside you, fighting for justice and for liberation. If your listeners want to find us, they can find us in all of the social medias. And we're at mmpride.org. But our name is just Metro Manila Pride. A lot of folks say, hello, Metro Manila Pride organization. It's just that somebody took Pride already. So we had to put org at the end instead of the underscore. But yeah, I think we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I think we're on TikTok, but there's nothing there. But you can follow us if you want to. There's nothing there right now. We're trying to figure out how to do things. Yeah, and I also want to give a huge shout out to all of the other LGBTQI plus organizations working alongside us, because all of the things that we're doing in the community right now, and all of the um, victories that we've had, is because of people who've come before us, people who are working alongside us right now, and it's all for people who are going to come after us. So yeah, and shout out to you guys. Thank you for doing this.
And thank you so much, talaga, Nikki, and Metro Manila Pride for joining our podcast. Thank you for gracing our event here today. So, all right, that officially ends our Kwentuhan for today. Again, I'm your host, Ulrik Espinosa, and thank you so much for listening to today's Queertuhan about the SOGIE-Specific Anti-Discrimination Bill.
To satisfy more of your queer cuento cravings, stay tuned to DevSoc's Queertuhan for more episodes that you can access through Spotify and YouTube. Like and follow our Queertuhan Facebook and Instagram page for updates on future Queertuhan episodes. Once again, this is Queertuhan, presented by the Development Society of the Ateneo, where we strive to amplify the voices of underrepresented minorities so that we can move beyond stereotypes and confront the lived reality of the LGBTQIA+ community in the Philippines. See you at our next Queertuhan.